Every day, we rise, challenging ourselves to work for what we believe in. At U.S. Border Patrol, protecting our borders is more than a job. It's a calling. Agents answer the call, working together to keep our country and communities safe. If you're ready for a new mission, join U.S. Border Patrol and go beyond. Learn more at cbp.gov/careers.
Hello and welcome to the Paddock and the Pavilion with me, your host, Stephen Wallace. We are off to the races today, Cheltenham races, ahead of the Cheltenham Festival with Brough Scott, one of Britain's most respected journalists and broadcasters. Brough will be at the festival working for ITV Racing, but for the next hour enjoy his golden memories of the Cheltenham Gold Cup. Brough reveals his top 3 Gold Cup winners, best horse never to win the race, best training performance, best ride, and his own favourite memory. Plus, you will hear a wealth of fascinating stories about the horses, trainers and jockeys he has met and worked with for over 6 decades. For me, it was a delight to hear Brough reminisce about the blue riband of steeplechasing. And if you are a racing fan, I hope you are, this is a show not to be missed. Hello, Brough. Thank you for joining us on our 250th episode to chat about your memories of the Cheltenham Gold Cup.
Well, I'm lucky. They go back to 1952. Quite a lot of your listeners probably weren't born then. Well, probably most of them, actually. But I was born, and in 1952, the winners of Mont, Tremblant, written by Dave Dick in Dorothy Paget's colours. She was a very famous owner. But we were living in Paddington, and for some reason we just got a TV. I must have been ill because after it was in March and it's school time. I was school age. I was about 9 I must have been. But I was watching it. I did watch it at home, and I remember seeing the image of this chestnut horse. That you couldn't see it was chestnut, but it sort of seemed perhaps lighter, didn't have a black mane, swinging down the hill. And it really was a big thrill. And I basically followed it ever since. My dad followed racing a bit, but 1950s London, I can tell you, was a pretty different place from what it is now.
Well, I looked up the race on Pate News. That tells you how old it is. And the favourite for the 1952 race was Freebooter, and ESB was also in the race.
Yeah, I mean, again, Freebooter, I remember Freebooter winning the National. Of course, in those days, you sampled most things by going to the newsreels. And my dad, we'd be taken to newsreels. People forget, well, there were precious little. It was a radio. Most people didn't have a TV for a long time. The first time people got TVs was for the coronation, 53, really. Not many people had them before then. We somehow must have got one building up for it or something. But it was different days. And of course, in those days, racing was still very high profile. And I'm not complaining because life's just changed, but football was very much, it was ludicrous really looking back on it. And I'm very pleased things have changed in that way. Football was very much sort of working men's game. Rugby was really more that. And people did follow football, but you didn't have great passions the way they are now. And of course you wasn't on TV. No football was on TV except for FA Cup matches, FA Cup final and England games. That's all that would be on TV. So local people followed their local teams, but you didn't have this all over lingua franca, which is what football is now. But no, it was, I'm very lucky to have seen it all. And of course, Cheltenham was always the sort of cradle of it all. And I was very, very lucky because when we were about 11, we went to live, my grandparents died, we lived near Broadway. And therefore, Cheltenham was a local course if you could get to it. And when I began to get very keen on riding and racing and that sort of stuff, I actually went to Frenchy Nicholson, the nearest trainer. It turned out that Frenchy Nicholson was he was the best trainer of jockeys of his time. He must have been, because he got me to win 100 winners. It was, but no, so my first experience of riding a racehorse was actually on Cleve Hill. So whenever I go to Cheltenham now, I look up at Cleve Hill, and I can remember those, back those days, which is, don't forget, for me, back 60 years or so. And if you ever haven't been, anyone going to Cheltenham, you ought to go up to Cleve Hill, walk on the hills there, because it's like you look down at Cheltenham, but you also, it's like being in the Lake District. It's wonderfully wild. And it's worth remembering that that's where the first Cheltenham courses were, literally on top of the hill. Anyway, let's get on with the horses.
That's right. Do you remember any other recollections of the 1950s? And when was your first visit to see the Cheltenham Gold Cup?
Well, I have good recollections of all of them. Well, I wasn't there knowingly until 64, because it was always in the term time, you see. Think about it. So I remember the 50s, Vincent O'Brien with Knock Hard. Vincent O'Brien had been winning everything. I mean, he was quite extraordinary what Vincent O'Brien did. When you think that Vincent O'Brien won from a stable that only had about 40 horses, he won the Champion Hurdle 3 years running. He won the Gold Cup 3 years running. And besides winning a whole mass of the Supreme Novices equivalent of, and he won the Grand National 3 years running. I mean, it was absolutely impossible feat. No one's got anywhere near it. And then he went on to win all the classics and the Art of Triumph and everything else. He was the first and greatest genius that I met in racing, and undoubtedly the greatest trainer, really, considering everything. But I mean, he was the king of jumping. A Knock Hard was his sort of. He was beginning. He didn't switch to flat later, but that was his last Cheltenham Gold Cup winner. 410 was trained at Cheltenham by John Roberts, who I literally used to rode for later on. 54. Gay Donald was a tough horse ridden by Tony Grantham, who I came to ride for later. Limber Hill was trained up the north. Kirsten was a mare trained up the north too. Burley Buick. And Roddy Owen was trained in Ireland. So it was quite varied in the 50s. And then we got into the 60s. Parcel, he was a very good horse in 1960. And Saffron Tart was ridden by Fred Winter. It's worth remembering the jockeys, because Fred Winter in the late 50s, 60s, he was the absolute governor. I mean, he was absolutely amazing. He was different from the jockeys you'll see today, or it's just different. He was short, quite short, very, very strong shoulders. John Oaksey has a great line. He said the first time he met Fred Winter, he was walking around the room on his hands. He was incredibly strong in the shoulders. And unlike any other person that I've seen, he would sort of sink into a horse and literally lift him with his body. It's like his legs and body were clamped around it. And he had that great thing which all absolute supreme jockeys have, of a sort of compulsion about him, that you knew he was going to beat the other horse if, somehow there could be inevitability about those last few strides. He's incredibly strong. And he won on Saffron Tartan, who wasn't actually a frightfully good horse, but very strong, and beat Parcel. And then the next race was Mandarin, who, you remember, he later became famous for winning the Grand Steep, but had a lot of leg trouble. But he was a very impressive little horse. He was a little horse, really. And in 63, he went to Millhouse, who we thought was the best everyone's head is the best we'd seen. Big black horse. And funnily enough, it was his first year chasing, and he actually had won a chase, his first chase at Cheltenham in the April meeting in 62. And I was riding there, ridden by Tim Brookshaw. And he'd been very clumsy, he'd fallen over hurdles, and Tim Brookshaw literally held him together. And once he got going, he completely powered away. And one was really shaken by how good he was. And then when the next year he went straight through, won the Gold Cup, absolutely brilliantly, beating a horse called Four Trio, who'd been a very good horse as well. But we all thought, therefore, that he was the horse that, would beat everything. We got carried away by him, we didn't fully register how impressive Arkle had been in what is now the Brough Advisor 3 Mile Novice Chase. And when next year Arkle, who'd won already, was beaten by Millhouse in the I think it's 6 years ago today, is it? Is it 60 years ago this year? Yes, it's 6 years ago. When he was beaten by Millhouse in the Hennessy, and it was very foggy, and they said he'd slipped. We said, oh, well, they would say he'd slipped. Even though Arkle had won his 2 races since, Millhouse had trotted up in the King George and things. So when we came, and that's the first one I watched physically in person.
You were in the weighing room two races after.
Well, I remember watching it very clearly, very cold, clear day. And it'd been snowing a little bit beforehand, but I must have been in colours, but I can't remember that. But I then was going back. And funnily enough, I don't really remember the weighing room properly because of course, for me, I was about to have my first ride at the festival. So that would be, for somebody, whatever, I was 20 or so, that was pretty important to me, almost more important than Arkle Millhouse. Well, it was that way. But we couldn't believe it. And when Arkle, he beat Millhouse so decisively, you did sort of feel that something had happened. And of course, it meant a huge amount to the Irish and everything else. And somehow, and of course, he went down into legend because, as you know, he then became, people began to realize he was a complete freak, Arkle. And he was the most, you asked me what my 3 best were, he has to be amongst the 3. You can't compare generations really anymore, you can compare footballers, but Arkle has to be certainly amongst the 3. You can't ever knock him out.
Would he have won a 4th and 5th if he'd have stayed fit?
Oh yes, because no one really, but I mean, he was further ahead of his contemporaries than any other horse has been. I mean, they made 2 handicaps. He was 2 stone ahead of the others, and he was, people. We mustn't get old and sort of stuff and nonsense, but I mean, it just he ran with 12 stone 7, and the next horse would have 10 stone. That sort of stuff, 10-7. I mean, it was quite astonishing what he did, and came back for more. I mean, he ran 6 times before that Gold Cup. But then nobody really opposed him. I'm just trying to see how many runners there were. I mean, there were 4 runners in that Gold Cup.
4 in 65 and 5 in 66.
Yeah. And, he was then immediately, he was actually odds against it in 64. Millhouse was favourite at odds on. But he was 130 on in 65. And in 66, he was 10-1 on. So actually, it became and all you were saying was, could he get beat? And what they did then, Debbie Ellsworth had a piece in the paper the other day. What you did is you pitched into the handicaps. And it was the same with Desert Orchid. Could he give 2 stone away? That's what you were trying to find out. No, they don't do that. We're in a different climate. Perhaps you wouldn't want to stress horses that much. But the fact is, you wanted to see how good they were. And also, there weren't that many moments. No, people want to just win the big one, and that's matters. No. But in the 60s, I mean, he was obviously the dominant memory, looking back on it.
Two races after that Millhouse Arkle clash on a Saturday, you, as you said, were riding at Cheltenham in the Cathcart Cup, and you came 4th on a horse called Worswell Major.
Worswell Major. He was a lovely horse. He had an extraordinary thing about him. You couldn't basically hold him. You just had to let him run. And I was sort of young and ignorant. It didn't really matter. I got to learn how to ride him. You just literally let him run. And he would, when the takes were up, he'd go flat out towards the first fence. And it was quite alarming because he put his head literally down between his knees. And you hear this drumming noise. And the drumming noise was his knees hitting his chin. And you were going, it was as if you were on a car with no bonnet. But when he got about 3 strides from the fence, he'd put his head up and jump perfectly. And as long as you knew that, you could terrify the other jockeys because you were going basically just said, let him run. And he's going as fast as he can go, and he puts his head up and jumps over it. He was still upsides at the second last. So I've got a picture somewhere which shows how old I am, of him jumping the second last with the grandfather of Tom Scudamore, who's now retired, aged over 40, which is Michael Scudamore, who won the Grand National, and was a very, very considerable. He won the Gold Cup too. He was a very considerable player and a wonderful man. But into the 70s, well, I tell you what, Woodland Venture, Terry Biddlecombe was quite a friend of mine and a terrific jockey. I remember Eddie Hardy. When Eddie Biddlecombe was fully fit, which he wasn't very often because he either had injuries, he had very bad wrists, he broke them a lot, or he wasted very hard. Nobody knew how to properly dart. And his idea, I remember you go to Turkish bars, sit in these plastic suits, but the way to keep yourself going sweating was to actually drink black velvet, which was Guinness and champagne mixed. Because it made you feel well, so you went on sweating. But it's not exactly a sensible thing to do. And as you know, his body was wasted, but he was a terrific jockey when he was fully riding. Into the 70s, you remember Lascargo won twice, who also won that with Tommy Carberry. He was one of those, don't often get the blinkered Gold Cup winner. Ran in blinkers, and he also won a national, didn't he, Lascargo?
Was he an underrated horse?
Right?
Was he an underrated horse?
He was an underrated horse. Someone wrote a rather sweet book about him. But
David Owen.
That's right. He's a bit underrated, but he wasn't a very exciting horse I never used to find. He didn't really thrill you. Some horses thrill you. Mont Tremblant thrilled you. Arkle 100% thrilled you. Funny enough, Glen Carriglady, who won, she was rather a brilliant ride by Frank Berry. I remember that. She was quite thrilling. And of course, the Dickler, he was a very thrilling horse. A great big horse, practically unrideable at times. First 2 pointer boys, he ran out. Quite a good rider. You couldn't really hold him. Only one person could hold him at home. And actually, Ron Barry, who rode him that day, was that was one of my contenders for the best ride in the. I've got three here. The best ride in the Gold Cup. He beat Pendle that day, and he was very hard to hold. Ron Barry held him. He knew that Pendle was one of those horses who didn't get 3.5 miles really fully, but he also was such a good jumper. He jumped front, and Richard Pittman had that dreadful situation of being in front and stranded, and the winning post is still 100 yards away, and it's going away from you. And of course, as you know, at Cheltenham, the key thing is that you get absolutely nothing from the ground after the last fence. And the last fence is twice as far from the winning post, really, as a normal, someone like Warwick. It's a full furlong and a bit from the winning post. And it's uphill, slightly uphill. So you can't just roll home. You get momentum, jump the last fence well, and you get to that junction. And you've still got, another 80 yards to go and slightly uphill. And that's why it is always so dramatic that the last few strides, you're never safe until you're past the line. You're absolutely not safe. And Pendle looked like he was going to win it, but the Dickler took him. But it was a great. Ron Barry was a
short head.
incredibly strong, naturally strong man. A bit like Dean Richards, the rugby player, just a naturally strong man. You could, riding a horse is rather annoying. You ride a horse that you find really, really hard work, to cope with. And Ron Barry get on it and just be able to, handle it easily. And you realise that he was a different dimension. He's a lovely man, actually.
Pendle was a very good horse, though. Won 19 of 21 chases at one point, and the only two he'd lost were the 2 Gold Cups.
He was a very, very brilliant little horse. One very big friend of mine had him after he retired. He was a brilliant little horse. He had 2 little bumps on his forehead, like a deer, as if he had. And he always reminded us a bit of a deer, the way he jumped. He was so spring-heeled. One of those horses who, when they jump, they spring. They don't hurl themselves over. And he was incredibly light on his feet. He was a single horse that was as light, He was very, very good jumper. Tell you what, Altior was at his peak, he was a bit like Pendle. Very, very, the phrase spring heel is an easy cliche, but it doesn't apply to many jumpers, but it 100% applied to Pendle. I think he must have been descended from the deer. What else in
you had a novice winner 50 years ago in 1974 with Captain Christie.
Well, that's another contender for best ride, Bobby Beasley, who dried out, come back. He was pretty crazy, Captain Christie. He'd fallen and done various things. And Pat Taff trained him. I remember going to go and stay with Pat, and he was a brilliant horse. He won the King George as well. He's a brilliant horse, but he was a bit crazy, and he made a terrible mistake at the last, and it was an extraordinary performance because Bobby was he won the champion hurdle 15 years before, and he was very much a touch jockey. He did things by. I remember talking to him once about it. He said he'd like to get rhythm. He'd be a very much a strokes player. He was a batsman. He liked to get things to flow for him. But what he was a very nervous person in the sense that, some people, the night before a big race, they wouldn't worry at all. Bobby would be very, very uptight about all that. And of course, what he did do, and there was much more alcohol around those days, he then eased the tension with alcohol, and that caught him out, and he was, he lost his job, and he got drunk. He then got dried out, and came back, and it was a tremendous performance. Probably the most heroic performance of them all in many ways. He beat the Dickler. The Dickler won the year before, and he beat the Dickler. But it was a great performance.
Coming up soon in the show, Brough recalls the amazing training feat of Michael Dickinson in the 1983 Gold Cup and the emotional win by the Irish mare Dawn Run in 1986. Remember, you can download the show on Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, Google or Spotify, and now on our YouTube channel. And now back to Brough, as he continues to look back at the 1970s.
What else in the 70s?
He also had Fred Winter training his first and only Gold Cup winner in Midnight Court as a 7-year-old.
Yes, I mean, it was an odd race that because it was actually run in April because the race was off with, I think it was snow, either snow or flooding at the March meeting. So they reran it. So it was actually very much a sort of unexciting meeting in the sense it didn't really have all the hick of it, I remember. But John Frankham won it with a very, very good ride. But it wasn't what you'd sort of hope it could be, if you know what I mean. The Thinker was rather a fun day because we thought it'd be off because it was snowing. It snowed so much that they delayed the start down at the start with snow on the course for about 15 minutes. I remember there's a picture of me somewhere in the paddock with snow all over my head. And I remember ringing up on the way home. Must have just started having mobile phones. So in the car, I suppose, and talking to Arthur Stevenson, who hadn't come down. He was very much a northerner, very trained in his own way, and his great line, Little Fish Are Sweet. He was happy to win a tiny race as a big one. Little Fish Are Sweet. But then you get into the 80s. Well, that is the thing. It's 80s, isn't it? Yeah. And you have Desert Orchid, which is, of course, it was the most dreadful day. It was a heroic performance, but I can't have it as a best Gold Cup performance. It it was a great achievement to win in that weather and everything else and things against Des Lorky, but he won by guts, not by brilliance. I mean, he was nothing like the horse, one at Kempton or one that won the Whitbread or won the Irish National and stuff. He got home and he managed to win the Gold Cup, which is terrific. Because as you know, he didn't seem to fire at Cheltenham. Going left-handed didn't seem to work for him. He got beaten in the Champion Chase, you remember, a couple of times when people thought he would win it. But he was, again, he was, has to be one of one's favourite racehorses because he danced every dance and he went out on his shield. His first race, he fell and laid for dead at Kempton and they nearly shot him. And the guy was sort of loading the gun when he got up. And his last race was King George, he fell at Kempton. And he fell over hurdles again. And he put his self on the line. He went in front. And he was the most popular horse. Him and Red Rum were out in front of popularity with the British public. Arkle was a sort of legend. But it was really more, historically, he was just awesome. But Red Rum and Desert Orchid became people's horse because they were in there pitching. I mean, Desert Orchid ran everything. I mean, he ran one, as I say, won Whitbread and the Irish National, and the King George and the Gold Cup, and the Tingle Creek, and got beat. I think he ran 74 times or something. Only quarter stars as a match for all that.
How incredible, though, in 1983 was Michael Dickinson's famous the first 5 home in the Gold Cup?
Well, you asked me what was the best training performance. That has to, that's like putting down 5 aces. There's no way anyone could. Sorry, I thought there were been 4 aces, 5 aces. What I can tell you is that at that stage, jump racing had been very old-fashioned in its treatment. Everyone had done the same thing in a way, and terribly slow in Britain. I remember when I was horses go out in summer, get hugely fat, come back, lots and lots of trotting, all very sort of slow work, and build them up. And Dickinson, followed by Pipe, they got much leaner and fitter. It's their key. And I remember though being and we sort of, it took time for one to become accustomed to what a really fit horse should look like, because they literally looked a bit different. And in the paddock before the Brigorn Gold Cup, which was, when was that? It was
1983.
83 at Brigorn Gold Cup. In 83, in the paddock with Ted Walsh, and we looked at each other, we looked at these horses, and we agreed that this time Dickinson overdone it. So these things, here we are. These things, they really are. They're too lean. He's gone the end of the season. They're much like hat racks. He's overdone it. And as they came home, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, we looked at each other and said, I think we might possibly be wrong on this. And I remember going to see Michael about a month later, not much more, and they were all out in the paddock, these horses. And they were still pretty lean. They hadn't got much fat on them yet. But he, that was his trick. He got them very, very fit. I'd missed one after midnight called Alverton, and he was one of those very sad ones. He won that, and then he ran the National, and it was always a doubt. There was a very similar one later with Synchronised. Ironically, Alverton ridden by John Joe O'Neill, Synchronised was trained by him. Always a doubt whether he'd handle the national fences, and he got killed at Beaches. Alverton, I remember, very sad. Synchronised got killed, but not actually got killed by being run into by loose horse and running out and running into something. But no, those 80s. I tell you, a very, very good horse is Bury Hill Lad. He was a very, very good horse. John Frankham, remember, won the Hennessy on him, but actually the Gold Cup he was ridden by Phil Tuck. But he beat Brown Chamberlain, who Frankham Road, but he was a very good horse on his day. And Jenny Pittman was a very good trainer. She never had many horses. I mean, she won two Grand National winners, didn't she? She had about 30 horses, but she really knew how to train them.
We also had Dawn Run in 1986.
That was, the most sort of emotional one. And it was the sort of pride of the Irish. No horses. She was a mare, and she won the champion hurdle. No horse had done the 2. John Joe was coming to the end of his career. He was always a immensely popular person because his whole personality and his riding style was sort of leaving it all on the pitch. What we didn't know, which makes it even more heroic looking back on it, that he'd got cancer already on him. He stopped, and he wasn't feeling particularly well. And that summer he stopped and went to training, and then he got cancer. The cancer came out, and he's very lucky to live. And he's a miracle, John Joe. And also, Dawn Run was owned by this rather mad lady called Charming Hill, who's the writer, Galopin Granny. And I remember going to see them at Willie Mullins' father, Paddy Mullins. And the old girl, she's about 60, was like a little sort of canary, really. She's popped up on Dawn Run, who basically ran away with her around 2 huge fields. I remember asking Paddy Mullins, sort of, what do you think about it? He said, I think the old girl loves it. And I'm not quite sure whether he was referring to Dawn Run or Charmian Hill. But no, it was a great day. It didn't look like Dawn Run was going to win it. She was a novice, really, and not. Her jumping was definitely an issue, and it looked. I went and watched it second last because I just wanted to sort of see whether. And they were really smoking to it, and she was losing the argument, and she had to jump it well to stay in the argument. And John Joe O'Neill put everything. He put everything on the line. He asked her up with everything. If she hadn't come, she would either have fallen, but she certainly would have lost momentum and wouldn't have won. But she stayed in the argument. If you remember, on the run-in, the 2 Dickinson horses they were spent. My thing I was saying about the last 100 yards at Cheltenham, they were completely spent. So then you get the immortal O'Sullivan line, the mare's going to get up. The mare's getting up is his line, isn't it? And she came past, but it was a extraordinary day. Now I jumped past. I forgot. So we went on to Desert Orchid, and you were mentioning Norton's Coin.
In 1990.
Who was 100 to 1. And Cyril Griffiths was a really, Desert Orchid was favourite that year. He was odds-on favourite. I've forgotten that. But it was unbelievably a pretty messy day. And Norton's Coin, Cyril Griffiths was he was a dairy farmer from Wales, and his great thing was he'd been up at 4 a.m. to milk cows, and he then come in the truck with Norton's Coin, won the Gold Cup, and he was going back. We were mentioning Graham McCourt before. Graham McCourt was a very very good jockey, very complete jockey. Looking down the list here, previous 2 jockeys were Richard Dunwoody, who was an absolute master and was on front of the pack in his time, and Simon Sherwood, who had a lovely, sympathetic way of riding horses, and he really suited Desert Orchid. If you watch his races on Desert Orchid, he gets a really beautiful tune out of it. Richard Dunwoody and Colin Brown jumped well, but no one got quite as good a tune out of him as Simon Sherwood did.
In 1994, we had a French winner. We might get another one of them in a few years' time.
Yes, the fellow, he got beaten by Cruel Ground in 1992, and that was a day when really. Nowadays, life, it's interesting, because in 92, how many years ago that? 30 years ago. Even then, which people had much less sensitive view of animals and use of the whip and things. there's no question that he'd have been stood down and should have been, in a sense, in any ordinary rules, he'd have been disqualified because Adrian Maguire chased him and he was one of those who responded, basically with a stick up or from the turn. And he got up and won by, what did he win by? A short head. Adam Conrad on the fellow, who was owned by the Marquesas de Montella, and Peter O'Sullivan was sort of share of it. He was under strict instructions. They could hit it, I think, twice on the run-in. And so he didn't hit it. And there's no doubt, in my view, that this is where it makes it very difficult. If he'd hit it a couple more times, he'd have beaten the cool ground. And if you won absolutely by excessive use of the whip, you should be disqualified. But of course, it's a very difficult deal because to disqualify a horse, you've got a war betting situation. It makes, it's VAR plus, but it will be very, very difficult. But I think now sensitivities have got to the stage where we've got it about right. People accept that the fact is, you do need to, at times, you need to use the whip to impart a sense of urgency. A horse doesn't know where the winning post is, and selective use of the whip is a useful thing because it's padded. It's basically a rolled up piece of padded rubber, and it's a bit like a newspaper, really, a rolled up newspaper. You whack it hard, it makes quite a lot of noise, and you feel the whack, but you don't feel any great pain. Think of a big bit of rolled up newspaper and someone hits you with it, but it makes you go. And when you're trying to wake a horse up or get it to stretch for the last two strides, if you say you can only use it 5 times or it's going to be, I think that's absolutely fine. And I honestly don't think anybody should worry about the, in a sense that somehow or other it's abuse. I mean, it's equine athletics. But an athlete, you want to make sure he fulfills himself to use better. Look at a human being, athletics. They really stretch for the line, but you want your horse to stretch for the line. If you do it right, you can't make him stretch more than he really wants to. But if you're just whacking him stupidly, then you need to be stood down. But enough of the sermons.
We might see another French winner next year or the year after.
Well, if that horse continues the way it looked at what's it called, Les Français, if that continues the way it looked at Cheltenham, at Kempton, I mean, it win the Gold Cup this year. I mean, it was absolutely, it was the most electric piece of jumping I've seen all year. And it was extraordinary to think that the next race after that was Constitution Hill, who was absolutely freakishly good as well. But no, if he is going to go for the French Gold Cup this year, but if he trains on, and as we see with Constitution Hill, to try and keep a horse healthy is difficult. But if he turns up, develops the way he looks at the moment, I don't think there's anything around anywhere near it. I mean, his time was 6 seconds, something quicker than the King George time over the same course. So he was 4 seconds, actually. I mean, he was coasting. Now we're into the 90s, and funnily enough, Master Oates, that was the first time we did it with Channel 4. But the one I remember was Imperial Call, because when he won, he was very much a sort of native Irish horse, and the Cheltenham wasn't as organised now in the unsaddling enclosure in Paddock, and it was complete chaos in the paddock, in the unsaddling enclosure. And I'm doing the telly, and literally I'm being whirled off my feet, and I got hold of Fergie. I had to hold on to him to stop him being sort of taken away in the tide. And Fergie Sutherland was rather extraordinary man. He had one leg. He got a wooden leg. And there's a famous story about him, which is worth rating, because one day at Kempton, he backed a horse, actually on the flat. He was training on the flat briefly in Newmarket. And it won, and he was right through, had rather old and sensitive bone, but he had his money on So he gave a great loop and went rushing down to the unsaddling enclosure. Got to the unsaddling enclosure and was there patting everybody and arrested. And the slightly nervous female owner was there with him. And someone prodded to him and said, handed him his wooden leg, which had fallen off on the way coming down. And it's always said that the lady fainted, but I'm not sure if that's true. But certainly the wooden leg came off. He wasn't prepared to stop. Anyway, luckily the leg stayed on that day, but it was chaos. Mr. Mulligan was a great big chestnut thing, and that was the first Tony McCoy deal. That was the sort of completely unrefrained McCoy. He wasn't nearly as subtle as he came later. He just rode it flat out. And I remember Frankham being, I still thought he was a bit sort of over forceful, and whatever. Frankham said, no, he is absolutely the business. And of course he was, but he was just launch everything at everything then. It's a very exciting sight if you've got a jockey who doesn't yet know enough that actually there are times when you shouldn't go for everything. He was just going for everything all the time. But the interesting thing is Mr. Mulligan, to remember, wasn't a perfect jumper. Remember the chestnut horse, big. He'd given Richard Johnson a terrible fall at Kempton. And it was a bit of an issue about his jumping. So it's probably a good idea. McCoy just, committed him completely. And he was like 20 to 1 or so. Well, he was 20 to 1. It was extraordinary. Then Couldawn Seymour business, remember him?
Paul Nicholls' first winner, I think.
Yes. Young Paul Nicholls, what was that, 1999? Just 25 years on, Paul Nicholls. It was amazing.
And then moving into the 21st century, you've got a horse that wins it 3 times, and you had the Corto Star Denman rivalry.
The best mate he was the best balanced Gold Cup winner. I mean, he was a perfect shape of a jumper. He was big but not heavy. He was sort of wasn't too long. He had a lovely head, balanced his neck. I remember going to see him at Henrietta's with Terry Middleton, when he was a novice, and he was just, and he had a great shape over a jump. I mean, he's a very, very good horse. He wasn't. I think it was funny. I don't think he was a great Gold Cup winner, but he was a very good horse. You can't do more than go on winning. He was very well trained, but he was a beautiful jumper. And I mean, it was one of the most tragic things, and one of the most wonderful pieces of courageous, open, open statement. When, if you remember, after his third Gold Cup, all the press were invited down to Devon Exeter to see him return his first year race the season to the Hall of Gold Cup. So there were lots of people down there, all standing down by the last fence. And you can't see that much, as you probably know, at Devon. But he's with the leaders, obviously everyone's expecting him to win. Turn into the straight, he begins to suddenly not be able to go as well. And then he actually is pulled out after the third last, sort of trots in behind and comes towards them and then collapses and dies. I mean, it's absolutely horrific. That's the best horse in the country, most famous horse in the country, dead in front of everybody, heart attack. And Henrietta Knight, trainer who'd always said to me, he's my best friend, she went before the cameras and she said, I loved him to bits. We looked after him. He's been the light of our lives and all the rest of it, Terry and I. She said, but when I started in this business, Dick Hearn, the famous trainer, said to me, if you have livestock, you're going to realise you're going to have dead stock too. And that's what's happened here. He'd had some hemorrhage inside. But by fronting that up, she actually made people understand that the most difficult thing about jump racing, flat racing too, jump racing in particular, if you do get horses killed, athletes are going to die. And it's a very hard one to take, but either you don't do it at all, or you're, of course, putting horses at risk, and you're putting people at risk. You try and do everything right, and then if life takes them, life takes them. and I'm prepared to take that risk. But you're doing it on behalf of another animal, so its responsibility is incredibly strong, and people feel it very strongly. And she expressed it very strongly, which is very good. Kicking King, he was a pretty brilliant horse. It didn't last long. I mean, he won the King George, Barry Geraghty, really young Barry Geraghty, 2000. And then you get into Quarter Star, Denman, the Quarter Star. It was extraordinary to have, for Paul Nicholls, at one train, to have two horses that good in next door boxes. I mean, literally. And Denman, I mean, Quarter Star was the toughest. He was as tough as Desert Orchid. And don't forget, did the same thing, really. He won the Tingle Creek and the Gold Cup. He didn't win an Irish National. But he was a very, very good horse and very tough and very brave, I remember the way he battled on when he was second to Denman. He wouldn't give in. He got well beat, but he wouldn't give in. He beaten 7 lengths. But he was really, really tough horse. Of course, he came back to the next year, but he was a very tough horse. Long Run was a very good horse, and of course Sam Welly Cohen was he was a very remarkable man. Because he was 100% amateur, but 100% took it seriously. He only rode his own horses and things, but I remember going to see him. He'd train in the mornings. Literally goes at 8 o'clock in the morning to a gym with a proper trainer, boxing man, and do sparring and various things. Then go and running a little business, which developed into a big business and dental things. He was a fully organised businessman, and won he won the King George, the Gold Cup, and the Grand National. As a 100% amateur. When you think how big those events are in the sport, I mean, no other sport has that as an achievement. You're not going to win. You're not going to win the Open or Wimbledon tennis or anything, are you? He's a very nice, easy guy. It's a great achievement. The Long Run was a pretty good horse too. Synchronized, you remember, was A.P. McCoy's sort of finest hour, because he wasn't a very good jumper, and he was under pressure from way back, and McCoy just wouldn't give up, and in the end he came through and won. He was just so extraordinary, and then the great regret for everyone, a bit like Alberton, he then took the risk and ran in the Grand National, and okay, it wasn't the fall that did him in. He got done into a loose horse, ran him into a fence, ran into a wall or something, broke his leg. It was a sad end to it all. But it was one of his great rides, one of the great rides, one of the 3 greatest rides. I'd say, no question.
And moving on to 2015 Coneygree, that must be one that's quite special to your heart.
Yes, if you remember, it was been owned by John Oaksey. When John Oaksey was getting, sadly, into his life, he began to get dementia, was struggling a bit to understand exactly where he was. But his daughter and son-in-law, Mark and Sarah Bradstock, bought him a little mare called Played Girl, and he had great fun watching her win she won her 3 times at Exeter, ridden by A.P. McCoy. They then got her home, and bred a foal called Carruthers, which won a whole lot of things, and another one called Coneygree. And Coneygree then won the Grand National, won the Gold Cup, making all the running. And it was a very, very happy day, trained by John's daughter and son-in-law, who were very, very small outfit. And it was a very happy day. I remember going on the radio afterwards, and they were asking me about it, and I was saying, well, I said people sort of think sometimes pontificate, look down their noses at racing, but being here, Cheltenham, and I was on that 5 o'clock Radio 4 program. They were going on about some politicians' wrangle. I said, what we're dealing with here gives you a feeling very different from what you're all talking about up there. And each to his own, but I'm very proud to be here today, not in Westminster. And I felt very strongly that it was a very special day for me. It really was. We're getting closer to the end now of these people. I mean, we'll make our choices later, Stephen. But there's some good winners. They're good horses without being great horses. John Cossack, because it's a great thing to win the Gold Cup. Sizing John, all tough. A Native River was a particularly tough horse. Remember, chestnut horse. Used to put his head down, real honest, hard worker. And we then begin to get into the Mullins era, don't we?
We've had 5 Irish winners on the trot.
Yeah, and of course, I was very pleased for Townend because for a long time he was very much seen as Ruby Walsh's understudy. That was him, and would never really fit into those. Ruby Walsh was just about the best jump jockey he's ever been, the most complete jump jockey he's ever been, in the fact that each generation, in a way, sportsmen, they get a bit more complete because they get a bit fitter and everything else. But Ruby was very, very complete. He was ready, and particularly around Cheltenham. But poor Townend knows very much now. You don't think that if only Ruby was riding this, and to start with, inevitably, if anything went wrong, you say, well, if Ruby had been on it, it wouldn't have won, it wouldn't have fallen, it wouldn't have lost, wouldn't have fallen. People forgetting that Ruby had his setbacks too. Plenty of falls and things went wrong for him on Quarto Star, and famously at the last hurdle, Gold Cup and stuff in the Champions Hurdle. But he Paul Town did very well there. But of course, the completely deal-breaking recent victory was Rachel Blackmore. And Rachel's the breakthrough there that she just is a very, very good jockey, and hopefully you can put the sort of, whether she's a woman or a man or whatever it is, she's a very good jockey. And there'll be plenty of there are plenty of very good women jockeys and plenty of very good men jockeys. There are always likely to be more successful men jockey because it's a physical sport, so you've got to be particularly talented. The sort of Brownie or Rachel. Brownie's got, is as good over presenting horse over a fence as anybody riding, and Rachel is as good or probably better than anyone else in reading a race through. But the physical toll will mean that less women will want to probably want to do it, and also be able to take it, because you're going to get hit. And the fact is, the female structure isn't as strong as the male structure. I mean, otherwise they'd be in the same. It's more difficult. Therefore, when one talks like this, people then immediately think you're running women down. I'm doing the exact reverse, because to achieve what Brownie Frost and Rachel Blackmore have done is even better than the statistics suggest, because it's very hard. It's a bit of prejudice, but it's just also more difficult because of the various things going against you all the time. But they're absolutely magnificent. I really have great admiration for both of them, but Rachel in particular, because she's so cool at organising a race. And the only trouble I find with all jockeys is that when they get into their 30s, I'd rather want them to stop, because I know that all they're going to do is it's very, very difficult to get out without it ending in hurt. You're going to get hurt. It's you're going to go to hospital every year anyway, but you just hope people are going to get out in one piece. I'm so pleased that Tom Skeeterwall got out in one piece, and AP got out in one piece, and Ruby just about, which is very nice. And then we got to last year where we had, I mean, what was exciting about last year, I remember writing about it for the Times, is we had, as thrilling a sort of last fence duel as you're ever lucky to get. It was a real good deal. And I always like to go and stand at the last fence, and to see them coming winging down there was everything to play for. Was what the whole thing I feel is about, and why Cheltenham's strengths, you're there, this natural arena with the Cleve Hill behind, and something that's a particular thing that is fitted in the English and Irish tradition, and long may it continue. The tide is running out a bit in public interest, we know that, but if you actually go and examine it close up, it's still an extraordinary thing. And the thoroughbred racehorse is a unique athlete. You think they're going 30 plus miles an hour, jumping an arc, 5 foot high, 30 foot long arc, amongst other horses, over 3 miles, carrying 12 stone, which is what 85 kilos. It's an extraordinary thing, and close up, you can never really see it quite so much on television. If you actually stand there and you hear them thundering down, going through, it thrills me still. Obviously, it thrilled me physically doing it, but it thrills me still. That's why I go and stand there. And let's hope that this Cheltenham will be as thrilling.
Well, let's hope so. That completes a complete rundown of the Gold Cup winners from 1952 to the present day. What would you say of those would be your favourite memory of a Cheltenham Gold Cup?
Well, favourite memories. Well, it's obviously Coney Gree. There's the second last. John Joe at the second last on Dawn Run was pretty special. But I think, you asked me to pick the best 3 winners. I think, despite Best Mate's, perfection, I don't think he was as good as Denman. I mean, the real stars were Arkle, Quarter Star, and Denman. If I look down that list, I think that, taking allowances for how good you are compared to your contemporaries, I think they stand out for me. And the best horse not to win the race has to be Pendle. I mean, he was a very, very good horse, as we talked, and it was unlucky for him. But you've got to roll it right. He jumped the last 2 well, and he was stranded in front. And when you go into best ride, Ron Barry's ride on the Dicklet is right up there amongst them. Obviously, A.P. McCoy's win on Synchronized is probably the most lauded because he was A.P. McCoy, and it was not a very good jumper, and he was having to lift it from so long. No one could believe he would win on it. I think my vote for the best ride would go to Bobby Beasley on Captain Christie, who was a fairly erratic horse in some ways, very brilliant, and nearly fell at the last fence. And Bobby was 38 and had been off for 5 years and dried out. Come back and deliver was extraordinary. And I remember us all thinking, to think, when was Captain Christie? Think of
50 years ago.
50 years ago, I was riding with Bobby, so it was ages after we'd stopped. It was a phenomenal performance. And as for best training performance, well, it's one of those things that, like I said to you at the time, you can't compete in cards if Pum has all the aces. And if you train the first 5 home of the Gold Cup, you no one really. Unless Willie Mullins had all the runners, it's not going to happen. It was again. I was very thrilled to be there that day. I mean, I'm feel incredibly lucky. As I said, the first time I saw it was 6 years ago, which is Arkle Millhouse. And I've, never actually rode in the Gold Cup, sadly, but I watched it then probably every year. I must have been there every year since 64. And seen some great jockeys and great horses, but above all else, Cheltenham is one of the greatest arenas in sport. I mean, it's got one of the greatest backdrops in sport. If you think of the backdrops down in Cape Town with Table Mount up behind you, but to have Cleve Hill up behind you, and this green setting of a sport that derived from a green setting and steeplechasing, galloping from field to field, is an extraordinary thing. And the fact that now, with television, it can be in everybody's houses, and the television coverage now is quite magnificent. I'm only a small, aged part of it, but they're doing all the things I hope one day I dreamt of them doing. With you can have close-ups, you can have cameras in running, you can have you've got the sectional timing, speeds. You can get involved. You've got people being interviewed immediately. They pull up. And when we were first doing television, we weren't allowed to do any of that. We weren't allowed to go into the paddock. And I remember a huge row at York one day when we went to the paddock the first time. But he got permission. The senior steward said, "You can't do that here." And I had to tell him, "Well, if you're going to throw me out, I'm going to say so on television." I mean, it was very difficult. And people were trainers would sort of say, "Mind your own business," if you ask them a question, things like that. I mean, the sad thing is, racing is now much more accessible and much friendlier in many ways than it's ever been. It's much better run than it's ever been in lots of ways. It's organised and the efficiency of everything. But it's actually got less part of public life than it was. It's not really anyone's fault. It's just happening. And of course, what is structural fault is that its financial position is impossibly bad compared to other race territories which have themselves locked into betting in a way we're not, because we have more options for betting for people who want to bet and aren't locked into it, and therefore in France and Australia and places there's a lot more money, and there's a lot more money people will go there. And jump racing has a market in France and Ireland whereby you can win a small race and sell a horse on the point-to-point field in France, in England, in Ireland, and the races for 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds in France mean you can sell the horses, won a race there for a ludicrous amount of money, considering what it's likely to win. And that's where it's going to develop. And we're in big, big danger here we're not breeding many jumpers, that it's going to become very much an Ireland, France-centric game with just the big festivals here for us. And, we've got it's very difficult for our top trainers to compete. What you have to try and do is make the owners have a good time here. And I think we are able to offer and trainers, the key is going to be syndicates and trainers really offering up, which you can do with racing in a way you can't do with football. You can have videos of practically everything. You can see your horse, from the moment you've got a share on a horse, you can see it from the moment he gets up in the morning. Anytime you can look at your phone and there's your horse doing something. And I think that's, you can't watch your football team, only watch your football team, once or twice a week. So we might be able to get somewhere there, but there's no doubt, looking down this list, compared to 1964, we are, racing's gone it's infinitely more organised and much bigger in some ways, yet it's got much lesser impact on British life. You look at the newspapers, that on the Saturdays, the good pull-ups in the Sun and the other red tops, but the national papers now, they don't have a correspondent. I mean, I was the racing correspondent for the Sunday Times. Doesn't have a racing correspondent now. The Times has one man when there used to be 5, and Rob Wright does all the tips and cleans up others, but don't have any other writers. Telegraph has Marcus Armitage and nobody else, really. So it's tough. It's very tough. But there we are. Our life moves on, and I just feel so lucky that I saw so much of it.
So who's going to win this year? Well,
in a funny way, it wouldn't surprise me if Shishkin did. It wouldn't surprise me. He's a very talented horse. He's always looked actually as if he wanted, for a long time, as if he wanted to go further. And it's sort of wary thing. Galopin Des Champs obviously ought to win, but that's, one of the truest sayings in racing is that it's an inexact science, and therefore, who knows? Who knows?
You will be there.
I'll be there. I'll be there, Stephen. Again,
60 years after your first ride at the festival.
60 years on, and I hope I'll have a few more, but not many, probably. I know what the betting is. That's why I've got to try and live every day.
Well, I hope you'll be there for many more years. And I must thank Tim Cox, who sent over the Cathcart Cup result of Saturday. I don't actually know the day in March 1964, but it was on a Saturday.
That's right. Yeah. It's often said that it was moved because Millhouse was going to run Arkle, but I think it would be an election or something. It's nothing to do with that, because you couldn't know that Millhouse and Arkle were running against each other for certain. You couldn't possibly switch it for the telly, in January or anything. It was. They had to move it for another reason. I can't remember what the reason was, but it was on a Saturday, and it was a cold day, but one that I'm happy to say I remember, and I hope I'll never forget.
Well, that's a good point to end our chat about the Cheltenham Gold Cup, which is celebrating its centenary this year. Enjoy the festival, Brough, and thank you very much for being my 250th guest.
Sports Social Podcast Network.